好，大家好，现在7点钟了，我们再给大家一点时间，欢迎大家来到我们退休系列讲座的第7集 Estate Planning。现在大家慢慢在进场，我们给大家一点点时间。好的，大家晚安，欢迎来到我们退休系列讲座今天的第7集 Estate Planning 信托和遗产规划。今天呢，我们非常荣幸呢，请到了一位专业的律师，而且不但如此，她还是我们校友之女啊，我们的第2代来帮我们讲解这个 topic。所以呢，今天的这个系列呢，是我们这个整个今天这一集呢，是我们整个系列的risk management 这一段的一部分。那么，请秀芝学姐挪到下一页。今天呢，我们主讲人是 Shannon 刘香凝然后呢，我们的秀芝学姐呢要做我们的 moderator， 谢谢2位。好的，那么现在呢是5月21号在下一集，在下一页。那么我们之前呢，在2021年呢讲过了一些 estate planning 的 overview， 而且也讲到 income 部分，还有最大的支出是 taxes。那么今年呢，2022年开始呢，我们就展开了一系列的 risk management。因为在最初的时候，我们有讲过我们要对于这个遗产的规划呢，我们能够有 control 的东西，我们尽量做到。还有一些东西是我们无法预测的，那我们只能 do our best。那这些就是属于 risk management 部分。那我们也讲过了 insurance， 也讲到说 Medicare 你各式各样的 option， 你以后可能需要 travel， 你的这个health insurance 要怎么样的考量。那么呢，今天就非常重要的就要讲到这个 estate planning 的部分就是说在我们身后你能够想到的东西有哪些东西是我们应该考量的？那还有一些人常常想，哎呀，我根本没有什么钱我好像不需要烦恼这些事情。那这样的想法是对的吗？那我们就今天要来学习一下。好，那我现在呢就把时间交给秀芝学姐，让她来介绍我们今天的主讲人。好，秀芝学姐。
好，大家好，我是秀芝，跟大华我们主持这个退休讲座系列已经现在是第7集了。那今天呢，非常的荣幸邀请到 Shannon 就是刘香凝来替我们做今天这个遗产规划的讲座。那 Shannon 呢，她是跟我们北一女的关系，是因为她的妈妈是1976年我们的校友所以呢 Shannon 算是我们的杰出的第2代北一女校友杰出的第2代真的是非常的荣幸能够邀请到她。好，那我现在先介绍一下那个 Shannon 的background。Shannon 呢，她是从小她就是在加州的那个 Bay Area 长大的，之后呢在 UCLA 念完大学，然后到 BU 的那个 Law School 在2011年毕业之后呢，他就参加了一个 law firm 在那边工作了几年之后，他2017年他自己独立出来开一个律师事务所所以是非常的不简单。那他在他们的 community 呢也是非常的 active， 他现在是3个不同的机构 organization 的那个 board member 一个是 Fremont Education Foundation， 第2个是 Friends of Children with Special Needs， 第3个是China Emerging Parents Council of Fremont。 好，所以呢 他现在是这个信托遗产规划方面的这个律师，所以以后我们的校友如果有任何的问题的话呢，可以向他请教。好，那今天呢，在我们演讲之前呢，我们要先声明啊，我们今天只是提供大家一些基本的资讯，而不是给予就是说那个法律的这个咨询哈，所以因为每一个人的情况不太一样，所以在你如果有这方面的需要的时候，你还是要去请教你的律师。好，那今天呢，我们主要呢会分这个4个到5个这个问题呢，请先呢帮我们讲解啊。第一个就是说，因为我们今天要讨论的这些问题呢，其实很多人都会有这样方面的问题，所以呢，我们把它就是列出来哈。比如说第一个，很多人说我已经有了遗嘱，为什么我还要信托吗？啊，所以这是第一个。然后还有就是说，谁需要做信托和遗产规划？啊，是不是每个人都要做呢？还是某些人需要做，某些人可以不用做？然后呢，有哪一些信托是比较常见到、比较常用的？那最后的话，最后2个呢是有一点关联性，就是说，那好，如果我们决定要设立信托的话，我们要把怎么样的资产放在那些信托里面？好，然后用什么样的方式把它放进去？所以这个今天就是我们希望能够向那个 Shannon 请教的地方。好，那我们就现在进入第一个问题啊，先请教那个 Shannon， 如果我们已经有遗嘱了，我还需要信托吗？好，那在 Shannon 在跟我们回答这个问题之前呢，我们先请他给我们做一个 definition， 这个定义 ，right？ What's the difference between will and trust？ 好吗？好 ，Shannon。请你开始。
好，谢谢。那我今天会大部分用英文讲，但是如果你后来有什么问题，你可以写一个 email 给我，我可以比较了解一下。So 我们先讲就是 terminology。第一个就是 will 遗嘱。这一些 definition 是从一个 website 叫 Investopedia。So a will is a document that indicates what are your wishes, 你的希望. So who do you want to leave your assets to? Whether it's your personal items, whether it's your other assets, who do you want to be in charge of making sure that happens? 谁是你的executor, 你的 personal representative. And if somebody has minor children who are under 18, who would you want to take care of them? 你想要谁照顾他们如果你不在? So that is what a will is. It is a document that basically is lining out your wishes if you have passed away. And then we can go to the next slide to discuss what a trust is. So a lot of people have heard more about a will, 遗嘱, than about a trust. A trust usually is known as 生前信托 or 信托, but a trust is your contract saying similarly, what do you want to happen to your assets? However, the trust starts taking effect in your lifetime. So that's why they call it 生前信托, because you're making it in front of you during your lifetime. It is already taking effect. So your trust says, what do you want to happen to your house, to your bank accounts, to your brokerage accounts? So 你的房子, 你的股票, 银行那样子. And when we have the trust, that lines out the wishes, but we also make sure that the bank, that the state is aware that you have a trust connected to those assets. So that is what allows the assets to not need to go through probate court. So probate court in Chinese is known as 遗嘱认证. That is a court process. So through a trust, we are saying similarly, who do you want your assets to go to? Who is the trustee who is in charge of following your wishes, making sure that the assets are used for your family's needs? They cannot change your wishes usually. They have to follow what you have written out. So that's the basic definitions of will and trust, 遗嘱和生前信托. But then what is the difference between them? So that is the first one on the next slide. So like I mentioned, we hear about a will a lot of times. A lot of times in the media or the news, you may have heard, oh, this person did not have a will, or this person had a will. But we do not hear as often about the trust. And so sometimes people may be confused. Well, if I have a will, why do I need a trust, or who needs which one? So the first thing is that a will, 遗嘱, is considered a death document because nothing happens until you pass away. Everything that I have, if I just have a will, is still in my name with the bank. It's still in my name with the state, just connected to me. So if I pass away and I just have a will, then it may still have to go through probate. Now, probate proceedings really depend on what state you live in. So for instance, in California, our probate system starts if you have $184,500 or more of assets that are subject to probate. So for instance, if you even have a house, you may be considering the concern about probate. And so that's the first thing. Again, California may be different from other states. Some states, maybe people are less concerned about probate than others, but California, it tends to be a long process. It tends to be very stressful and can cost a lot of money to go through the process. So when we are trying to avoid probate, usually we want to make sure we have a trust if our assets are above the probate threshold, because a trust is effective during your lifetime. So that means that even though for most trusts, revocable trust, you can change your wishes, you can change what assets are in the trust, you can change who you want the assets to go to, who is in charge. It's a living document, but because it is starting during your lifetime, as opposed to a will that only takes effect when you pass away, that is what allows us to bypass probate when we are funding the trust with the real estate. So there may be situations where someone will just decide they want to have a will. For instance, maybe if somebody is, 90多岁 and they do not have much money anymore, all of their children are adults, they do not have any restrictions, any things that they need to be concerned about. They may just have a will saying, this is who I want my personal items to go to, because they are not concerned about the probate threshold. They're not concerned about any particular special needs that may be an issue. But for most people that we see, typically, if they have a house, if they have bank accounts, if they have family members who they want their assets to go to, then they may be thinking about the trust. Again, it may be state specific. For instance, in New York, their probate process can be a lot less stressful than California. So some people may be more concerned about the will than the trust, but it's very good to speak to an attorney in your state to understand what is important for your family's needs.
OK， 好，谢谢 Shannon 帮我们稍微讲解了一下哈。那我这里呢，再给大家补充一下啊，用中文补充一下，就是说什么叫做 probate 呢 ？probate 的意思就是说遗嘱认证。OK， 为什么要认证遗嘱？因为你想啊，因为遗嘱有时候有些人可能是伪造的，对不对？所以呢，这个人去世之后，他有一个遗嘱，那我们怎么知道他这个遗嘱是有法律效应的？是不是真的还是假的？还有呢，有些人他可能写了不同好几个版本的那个遗嘱，对不对？那到底哪一个遗嘱才是正确的呢？所以像这些呢，就是都是会引起一些纠纷啊。所以也是这为什么这个原因呢？如果这个人 pass away 了以后，法院第一个要做的事情，先认证有几份遗嘱，然后哪一个遗嘱是最后他写的遗嘱，那个才是有效的。这样子 right 对不对？所以这个是为什么需要认证遗嘱。那 trust 就没有这个问题，因为 trust 的话它已经就是一个 legal 的 contract 一个 document， 它已经写得很清楚，它里面它的财产或者是资产要怎么样去分配，对不对？给什么样的 beneficiary 这样子。那我这里呢可以给你们举一个实际的例子，就是我 就是说接触到了一个例子，就是这样子，就是说在纽约市在有一个姐姐呢，她在 COVID 2020年那个时候，在 pandemic 的时候呢，她因为病而去世了。那去世以后，她没有结婚，没有小孩，那所以她的遗嘱上面呢写的就是她的弟弟跟她的妹妹各分一半她的财产。可是呢，因为那个 COVID 那个期间 pandemic 对不对？所以呢，全部 city lockdown。包括那个法院都封锁，根本就是没有开，法院根本没有开庭，所以呢，他们这个 family 呢，经过了2年多，到现在最近才开始完成他这个认证所以就是说，其实是一个很简单，你觉得是一个很简单的一个遗嘱，可是，在发生这种情况的时候，那个法院没有开，你这个没有办法认证的话，所以呢，他们这个 family 的他所有在银行的资产，在 brokerage account 里面所有的资产全部冻结。就是没有办法，这个弟妹知道他们是这个遗嘱的这个 beneficiary， 但是他们都没有办法去碰那个银行的钱，也没办法去拿这个 brokerage account 所有的 account， 所以这是一个真实的事情所以就是为什么你单单有遗嘱是不够的，还要懂得保护自己。好，那我们接下来第二个topic 呢，就是请现在帮我们解释一下，那谁需要做信托和遗产规划？
Thank you. So like you mentioned, probate process can take a lot of time, especially with COVID. The courts were closed for so long. And during that time, yes, the assets are frozen, which means that if there are expenses that need to be paid, any sorts of debits, the family may need to just pay that themselves until the court process is finished. And also it can be quite expensive. So when people are trying to avoid probate, for instance, in California, probate can be about 4% of an estate. So if you have a $1 million estate, $46,000 roughly may need to go to pay for the court fees, if there's attorney's fees, executor fees, before anything can go to the family. And then if there's not even a will, the probate just has to go according to the legal rules. So it has to go to the closest of family. Maybe that's not who you wanted to go to. Or if we have children who are young or people who have special needs, then there can be some complications. So when we talk about people who are looking to do estate planning, that kind of covers a lot of these situations. But in the US, you have to be at least 18 years old. So 需要已经18岁 because you need to be an adult who is able to make your own decisions. So if somebody has incapacity, maybe they had a stroke, they cannot make decisions anymore, then there may be a problem to get estate planning. That's a conversation we have a lot, is even if I'm healthy, 如果我很健康，没有什么问题, I don't think anything's going to happen to me. Getting the estate planning does not mean you think that you are going to pass away soon. It just means that you want to do the planning when you can, when you have the time, when you know what the wishes are. Because in those situations, if someone has a bad accident, then the family may be stressed out saying, oh, what can we do? But then it still may be too late to make a decision without the court. So people have to be at least 18. Typically speaking, they're trying to avoid the court to have to do the 遗嘱认证 process. They want to make sure the family does not need to be worried about that. Usually people want to make sure they're doing the estate planning, that it's clear what their wishes are. Who is it that they trust to be their 手签人 to make the decisions? Who is it that they want the money to go to? If they have young children, at what age can the kids make the decisions instead of the trustee? Those sorts of things, because the common person with the estate planning wants to make sure everything is clear so that the family does not have to have those questions, does not need the court to make those answers. Depending on the state you live in, some people may be concerned about asset protection, but typically the big issue is making sure the family can have the easiest process if something happens to you. So a lot of times people will do their estate planning because they had a friend who maybe their family had to go through probate and it was very, very stressful and 困难. Or they had a friend who their family had a trust, and it was so much easier. So they thought, okay, I want to do it. So usually there are a lot of reasons for estate planning. Again, if we're looking to avoid probate, that's not just for multimillionaires. In California, it's just above that $184,500. So for many people, this is something that they should be thinking about learning more.
好，所以呢，一般呢，像在做这种所谓遗产规划的时候，那个律师呢，大部分都会给你这个4个不同的 document， 来，一个就是这个遗嘱，我们刚刚先生已经解释过了啊 ，living trust 啊，这些都是必要的。那另外呢，还有2个 document， 一个叫做 power of attorney， 然后另外一个的话就是叫做那个living will。好，那所以这2个呢，我们现在请先生帮我们稍微解释一下。
So when we do estate planning, oftentimes people are thinking about 遗嘱, thinking about 生前信托，没有想到现在的问题。So these documents we consider incapacity planning, the power of attorney. 如果你没有办法自己决定钱的关系，谁可以帮你签名 make sure that the transactions are taken care of, bills are being paid. Because if you lose the ability to make your financial decisions, then there may need to be a court process called conservatorship to be able to make the decisions. Same thing with probate, can take a long time, can be very stressful. So power of attorney is meant to allow the person you trust to be able to sign for you, to be able to make sure that the expenses are taken care of, so there's not any creditor problems. Depending on the power of attorney you want to do, it can give a lot of power, it can give smaller power. And then depending on which state you live in, you can either set it up that it is effective immediately, or it's only effective if your doctor says you cannot make decisions. So it's very important to think through for the power of attorney, who do you want to make the decisions for finances, as well as what can they make decisions, and when can they start making them, depending on the state regulations. And then we have the healthcare directive, the living will. So this says who can make your healthcare decisions if you cannot. So 谁可以帮你决定健康的关系. It will also indicate things like, what are some of the wishes? If there's a situation where you need life support, end of life treatment, what would you want to happen? Do you want to be an organ donor? Do you have a wish regarding burial or cremation, or let the family decide? So this is very important, because if the doctor does not know who to call, it can be very difficult. They may need to, look through your phone, or they may need to try to do a background search to see who is the closest of family members. And sometimes, even if you're married, that may not be the person you want to make decisions if they are not as equipped to talk about medical. So the healthcare directive makes it easier for the doctors to know who can make the decisions. They do not have to argue about which family member is involved. And then the family member knows some of what your wishes are. So power of attorney, healthcare directive, although it may not be something effective right now that you need, if it isn't needed, it can be very important.
好，这里的话我也稍微补充一下哈，就是这个所谓的 living will 啊，你不要跟那个所谓 living trust 两个混OK， 因为那个名字看起来很像，但其实是不一样的东西哈。所以那 living will 呢，意思就是说你在昏迷不醒的时候，对，比如说重病，或者是说在人生的最后一程的时候，那个时候已经昏迷不醒，没有办法做一些医疗方面的决定的时候，那个时候比如说医生要决定要不要给你插这个气管，或者是要不要给你用这个胃食这方面的。那有些人的话，他是不太希望在他人生的最后一程的时候还要身上插很多的管子啊，所以如果你有这样子的那个需求的话呢，就是最好先 set up 一个这个就所谓的 healthcare 的 directive 啊，就是如果万一这种事情发生，这个时间来到的时候，对不对？那医生可以根据你自己的指示来帮你做医疗的处理啊，所以这个是很重要的。还有就是说，有些人的话会愿不愿意就是愿不愿意把自己的那个器官 donation 之类的啊， 所以呢，这个把自己的意愿现在清醒的时候，在现在还可以做计划的时候，就先把它处理好，这样子。好，那我们就现在跳到下一个 topics， 那就是讲到说，那有哪些信托是大家比较常听到的，或者是比较常用到的啊？那请那个现在帮我们解释这张图表。
So there are some differences depending on which state you live in. But typically, when people are setting up the first base trust, because they want to avoid probate, if they're not concerned about tax issues, they just want to avoid the probate, then they usually will have what's called a revocable living trust. So it's called revocable because that means that you can make changes later on. If you want to change the assets in it, if you want to change who the assets go to, if you want to change who the trustee is. So that's the first thing. Then it depends on which state you live in, depends on if you are married. So if you live in a state like California, California is what we call a community property state. So that means if you are married, all the assets that you have after you get married are 50-50, regardless of who's making the money, unless you have a separate agreement or unless it is an inheritance or a gift that you have received. So in California, usually people will have a joint trust with their spouse if they are married. So a joint trust is set up that it's between me and my husband. All of our assets are within that trust. We are still making the decisions. Everything is still connected to your social security number. There's no new tax identification number that you need during your lifetime because you are still making the decisions. But then with a joint trust, the next thing is if something happens to me, then what happens with the trust? So in some joint trusts, it is that the second spouse, they can control everything. They do not have to change anything to a new trust ID number. They can make all of the decisions. And then when that spouse passes, it goes to whoever the beneficiaries are, whether it's your kids, whether it's charities or other family members. So then there are some other options when we have a joint trust. Something that people had heard about a lot, maybe 15, 20 years ago, is AB trust. And what an AB trust meant is we still have the joint trust when the spouses are living. So everything's in the one trust. But then when one spouse passes away, it has to split 公平一半一半, A trust and B trust. And the A trust, the surviving spouse has full control, can decide what they want to do. They can change who the assets go to. They can have full decision making. But the B trust, the other half, is irrevocable, meaning that it has locked into place. The surviving spouse cannot change the wishes for who the assets will go to in the B trust when they pass away. And they may have some access to the B trust to use, but they don't have as much access as the A trust. So the reason why I said maybe 15, 20 years ago, people heard about that was because the estate tax exemption was 比较低很多. It was a lot lower. And so people were more frequently concerned about estate taxes as well as probate. And the AB trust allowed for some deferral, not the elimination of estate taxes, but deferral of estate taxes if there was a concern. AB trusts also sometimes are used if there is a person that had a second marriage, or maybe they have blended family with kids from different spouses, because it allows for there to be some protection of the B trust. And then something that I see more frequently in California that I like to do is called an optional disclaimer. So that means during the spouse's lifetime, same that one trust they're using. But if one spouse passes and there's a concern or there is an estate tax issue, then the second spouse can decide shortly after the first spouse passes that they will disclaim some of the assets so that it will not count towards the surviving spouse's estate taxes. but it's only optional. It's only used if there is a tax situation, whereas the AB trust is a required splitting. And again, if you have questions, you can reach out to me, reach out to an attorney in your state, because this can be very confusing. So that's the joint trust. When we have two people together during their joint lifetimes, usually no changes to their taxes. They're still making the full decisions. If one person passes, there may be differences in how they decide to proceed.
We can probably stop here before you go to the irrevocable.
Okay.
OK， 因为这个地方呢，我想大家可能会比较有兴趣要发问一些问题哈。为什么呢？因为像这个所谓的 joint trust 啊，那现在我有一个问题，就是问您，就是说这个 joint trust is more commonly set up in the community property states。
是
啊。对，那如果是像其他的呢？因为美国的话有9州是9个 state 呢，就是用这个所谓的 community property state，right？ 像这个 California 是对，但是像比如说纽约、New Jersey、Maryland 这些 state 呢都不对。那所以如果是像这种另外的这个就是所谓 separate property 那个 state 的话，你也会建议他们用这个 joint trust 吗
？It depends on the situation. I see a lot of people who they live in New York and they may have a separate trust. So between a husband and a wife, the husband has his own separate trust. The wife has their own separate trust for the different provisions. So I'm not a New York attorney, so I cannot say for sure if that's always what they do, but that is much more common because it's separate property trust state.
OK， 那我还有另外一个 question， 然后等一下看看那个可能 Grace 也会有类似的问题哈。那我现在第二个 question 就是说有关这个所谓的 estate tax 的 exemption amount，right？ 因为现在的话呢是很高的，现在的话就是一个人的那个 estate tax 的 exemption amount 是大概是 12.06， 那如果是夫妇2个人的话，应该是 24.12 million，right？那如果是你现在全部都放在这个所谓的 joint trust 的话，那它的 exemption level 是多少
？So if we put it in a joint trust, we still have the same estate tax exemption. We don't get a change to the estate tax exemption. But like you said, right now, the U.S. estate tax exemption, $12.06 million per person. If it has to be a married, both U.S. citizens couple, then we can add it together. So if one spouse passes, the other spouse can file a form called 706 with the IRS. That's called the deceased spouse's unused exemption amount. And that allows to 加起来就是那个24 million that they can put together. But it is important to note that number can change over time. So right now it's 很高, but it will change. And if and when it changes, we're probably looking more around $6.5, maybe $7 million per person. So then 加起来 can be more like $13 or $14 million for a married couple. So still the numbers are on the higher side, but it is important to be aware that there can be changes. So if that affects you, you should be looking into that or speaking to your attorney if there's any changes you need to make.
对，因为最近就是几年前那个重新设的那个 tax exemption amount 呢，从原来的6个 million 呢，现在变成12个 million。可是这个呢，到2026年的时候就要 expire， 对，所以那个时候那个 amount 呢会降回原来的6.2个 million，而且好像 estate tax 要升高变成 45%。
Yeah, so estate taxes can be quite high if you have that much money, that people will start to think about, more complex planning, whether they want to start giving during their lifetime or whether they want to set up irrevocable trusts. There are different options that people may have if they are trying to avoid the estate tax or lower it.
Grace 有没有问题？
谢谢。刚刚2位都已经提到了，就是有关这个estate tax exemption 的问题。我想那个是一个 trigger for a lot of people to do irrevocable trust， 对不对？主要是 for tax planning purposes 哈。那 I think we should plan for the worst, thinking, right, the exemption limit may drop back to 6 million 哈，又变回6个 million 一个人啊，两个人是12、13左右，是不是啊？这个附近对不对？那我就是要提醒大家，尤其是加州的校友们，对不对？加州的 property 的 value 就已经非常高了，再加上我们以前讲的，你们两个人如果都工作，你们两个的 401k， 加上你们的一些房产，这个20年后哈，30年后。不是没有可能的啊，所以大家是要想一想这个 tax 的这个 consequences。所以呢，我们继续听啊，我的问题呢，可能等一下会出来，有关于这个 irrevocable trust 的这个问题就比较复杂啊。OK， 那我们继续听。
Okay, so we talked about the revocable trust, which means you can make the changes to what's in the trust, to what the terms are. And that's usually because you're trying to eliminate probate. But then there is some tax planning with the AB trust or the optional disclaimer, if there's a potential for estate taxes, but we're not sure. When people are sure they have estate tax concerns and they want to do something about it, they may set up the irrevocable trust. The difference between that is that the irrevocable trust, when you put it in, it's locked. So you cannot change who it goes to later. You cannot change the terms easily like the revocable trust. But the reason why people have irrevocable is because they are saying, I have enough money otherwise, so it's okay to lock it in these terms because I will be okay. I want to have the tax strategy. The typical trust that we talk about so are the GRATs, the charitable remainder trust, and then one that I forgot to put on here is the irrevocable life insurance trust, the ILIT. And so GRATs are commonly used if someone knows they have an asset that is at a low market value, but it's going to increase a lot. So say somebody works for a tech company that's starting up, but it's going to go public in a couple of years or whatever time. We don't want them to do insider trading, but if they know to some degree, then they can maybe set up a GRAT in time before that stock goes public so that the cost basis for that is at the price that they got it. Maybe it's $2 versus the price that it eventually will be at, maybe $200. So that does require some forward thinking for the GRATs. And then the GRATs, allows for some annuity, allows for a certain time frame, but during that time frame, we are locked in. Then we have charitable remainder trusts. So these are utilized when somebody maybe has that estate tax concern. They might want themselves or their kids to get some income from this asset that they're putting into this charitable remainder trust. But then the remainder, they want to go to a charity. So usually they're doing a big charity like say Smithsonian or Monterey Bay Aquarium. A lot of those large nonprofits will have their own team that can administer the charitable trusts. But those are utilized when maybe you're still looking to have some income stream, but ultimately you're okay with the asset going to a charitable purpose. And then I know, Grace?
Yeah, 我有一个我想要补充一下哈，就是 back to your GRATs example 哈，这个 grantor retained annuity trust or any grantor retained trust。我想最重要的目的to use this vehicle 是因为你在生前 when you give this property to the trust， 它是在一个这个 low base value， right？ 就像刚刚 Shannon 讲的 ，before your company stock goes public， it was at a lower value， 然后它涨上去的时候呢，你已经放到 trust 了，那已经不是你的钱了，所以 it's not subject to your 那个 estate 的那个 exemption limit， 是不是？我们放进去的时候 count towards the 12.06 million 的 limit， 对不对？ Yes. 对，假如说我有一栋房子，现在我用一个 round number， 现在价值1 million， 然后我把它摆进去，那我把这个1 million 从我的12 million 里面拿下来 ，OK？ 但是这个房子将来涨成3 million 的时候，它不算我的，那个3 million 就已经 go beyond 我的12了。我不晓得我有没有解释清楚，这就是为什么大家 很喜欢用这个grantor trust， 是你的 exemption deduction 是从你给的时候的 value， 而不是将来的 future value， 对不对 ？Shannon, did I explain
So at the
that?
time that the trust was created, as opposed to potentially if it goes much higher, that level.
Yeah, 就 that's why 那个 insurance 的 trust 对不对？I forgot the name of it， 就是irrevocable 的 insurance trust 也是一样，因为你的 insurance 你这个好像 whole life 一样，你一直放钱，它有一个 cash balance，right？ 万一你不幸去世了，那你有一个 insurance proceeds。万一你活着呢，你的 payment 付完了，将来你去世的时候，它这个 value 也是这样子。所以你为什么用 insurance 这个 trust？ 就是因为你进去的钱，比如说你这是一个 10 payment 1 million 的这个本钱的这个 insurance 的话，你进去的时候只是扣掉1 million towards your $12 million。可是将来这个1 million 也许涨成4 million， 它是不是用那个4 million 去算的 ，right？ 所以呢，这就是为什么常常有一些insurance 就搞到这个 irrevocable trust 里面去，就是因为这个原因 ，yeah.
And so when people are using life insurance as a mechanism, I'm not a life insurance agent, but they may have two different operating modes. So one is maybe they just buy life insurance policy. They say, I'm going to have estate taxes, so the life insurance will pay down the estate taxes. And then the other option is maybe they set up the Irrevocable Life Insurance Trust, the ILIT, which is for a different reason. It's that we don't want that life insurance amount to count towards the exemption. So one is that you're using it to pay off the estate taxes, but if we use the trust, we're using it to not count to the exemption the same way. But then something to be aware of is if you want to set up an ILIT, the Irrevocable Life Insurance Trust, it's good to make sure that you're thinking through, is it a second to die policy if you are married, or making sure that you are in good health when you're thinking about it. Because if you have an existing life insurance policy that is not an ILIT, and then you want to change it to be an ILIT, the insurance companies may have some things that you need to deal with.
对，懂了。好，这样现在大家清楚了吧？就是说，把那个 life insurance 放在这个 irrevocable 的 trust， 或者是说就是一个 separate 的一个 regular 的那个这两个目的是不太一样的。虽然他们都是你死后都能够拿到这所谓的 death benefits， 对，但是这个 death benefit 如果是放在你自己的名下的话，那还是属于你自己的 property。还是会抗在你自己的这个 estate 里面，对不对？但你如果是放在这个 ILIT， 就是 irrevocable life insurance trust 的话，那就不算是你的。
还有一点我也许替大家问一下，就是常常有人搞不清楚，就是说insurance proceeds 如果有 death benefit 不是 tax free 吗？那为什么还有这些问题？所以大家不要搞混了，这个 death benefit 是income tax free， 但是不是 estate tax free， 对不对？是不是这样子？好，
对。And then that's worth to say, if you do not have an estate tax issue, then those assets will go to your kids or whoever without the taxes. But if they use those funds and they invest it, then they will have their own income tax for that. But then the initial transfer to them does not have tax.
好 ，OK， 好，那这个呢，其实我们刚刚已经讲过了。如果找这个 trust lawyer 的话，一般他们就会帮你准备这些的 document 啊。那个现在要补充的。
So typically the trust, will, power of attorney, healthcare directive, so that we are bypassing probate, we are making sure that the court does not need to get involved for other reasons.
好，那我们现在呢进入到最后的一个主题，那就是说，好吧，那我们如果决定要设立信托，那我们要怎么样把我们的资产放在这个信托里面？
我可不可以插一个嘴啊？刚刚那些 document 哈，那常常有人会搞不清楚，就是夫妇两个人就搞不清楚这些 document 在谁手里，或者是怎么样。那是不是 always right? They can go back to their attorneys， 对不对 ？They can always there's a copy kept with the attorney's office, correct?
It depends nowadays. So in the past, maybe attorney will keep hard copies in a safe, but now we have a lot more digital presence. And so our usual protocol is that our client keeps the original hard copy, and we keep a digital copy of everything. So if later our client has a question, or maybe they passed away, their family member cannot find the documents, if they can prove to me who they are, they can prove to me that the client has passed away, then I can share the documents with them. So now the typical protocol is more that we keep the digital copies as opposed to the hard copies. But most attorneys are pretty good about keeping everything. But that's very important, though, then that you tell your family, 我已经做好这个生前信托，这些 paperwork 在哪里? So if they have it on the bookshelf, if they have it in the office, but 千万不要放在一个箱子，如果锁住它没有钥匙 then there can be a problem. So if you're going to put a lockbox, make sure they have the key, they know where it is. Otherwise, it can be very hard if they need to search and search, not sure what to do.
OK， 我借用30秒钟跟观众讲一下哈，大家有一些观众可能不知道在哪里发问啊，在 YouTube 里面你必须压那个东西叫 Live Chat， 它是在这个荧幕的下面有一个 button 叫 Live Chat 啊，你要压这个 Live Chat， 你才有办法提问问题哈。我只是跟大家讲你怎么问问题。好，谢谢。
Okay. And then now we can talk about the funding of the trust. So when we have a trust, we need to make sure that it is funded. So a good way to think of this is 你有自己的皮包，你的钱要放在里面 or you don't have it. Same thing with a trust. If you have a trust, but say in California, your house, your bank accounts are not connected to the trust, 超过这个$184,500, then there's a probate problem. So not only do we want to have a good trust, but we also want to make sure that it's funded correctly. And that depends on what kind of asset, what kind of account it is. So there are some types of accounts, typically 股票或是银行, that we can change the type of account to the trust. So that does not mean that you do not have control. It's still in your name, as well as the trust, so that the bank knows, the brokerage knows, you can still make the decisions. But if something happens to you, the trust is there, so it does not go through probate. It is easier for your trustee to manage the funds if you cannot do so. Everything is still under your social security number. You do not need to change your checkbooks, change your credit cards or debit cards, but they know that there is a trust. So that's very important. When we set up the trust, we still have to do a little bit of homework with the banks. It's not too hard, but it can take some time depending on how many banks, brokerages you have. Then there are also assets that are just by beneficiary designation. So it says, if I pass, who does it go to? And typically that is retirement accounts or life insurance accounts, policies. So depending on your particular situation, it may be very important to list the trust as a beneficiary so that it's clear if something has happened, it has to follow the trust. And for me, for my firm, a lot of other firms, hopefully, we ask clients, where are all your accounts? Where are all the policies? Because different banks, different brokerages, different companies may have slightly different rules or protocol. So we want to make sure that the clients know how to do this correctly based on their own assets. And then the biggest thing for most people is the house, the deed for the house. So typically, when you buy a house, if you just buy it by yourself, it just has your name on the property. If you buy it with another person, then it has both of your names. And then it will say, you know, based on the designation, how much percentage you have, that sort of a thing. But when we have a trust, we want to change the deed. So the deed would still have your name on the new deed, but it would also want to have the name of the trust. So this does not matter if your house is in California, if your house is in New Jersey. It's important that the records with the state indicate the home is in your name and the trust, because that is what proves to the state, to the county, that there is a trust it is connected to the house does not go through probate. So that is something we work a lot on, is making sure the houses are correct, working with clients to make sure that the different assets are appropriately in the trust. And if you open up new accounts later on, very important to make sure you open it up correctly based on your needs. And then the last thing is, if you have assets, for instance, in Taiwan, most trusts, unless they are very complex, only hold the US assets. So your US houses, brokerage, etc. If you have assets in another country, it typically has to follow that country's laws. Like in Taiwan, the probate process, the succession is not as difficult as it is in California. But if you still have assets there, it's good to see what you need to do with somebody in Taiwan.
好，那这里的话，我可以先问一个问题，然后那个我知道大华还有另外一个问题可以问哈。第一个问题呢，就是说其实就是跟大家提醒了哈，因为像比如说有这个 Beneficiary Designation 的，像比如说像你的 401k 401哈，或者是 IRA 的话，你那个 Beneficiary 这个是它的第一顺位，就是说你如果有一个 401k， 以前的 401k， 你比如说是你以前前夫的或者是前妻的名字。可是你忘了把它改，可是等到你的遗嘱上面，或者是说你的 trust， 你就是说，我这个所有的 401k 要给我的小孩，到这个时候呢，那个法律是认证那个你的那个 beneficiary designation， 那是他的，
那就是很麻烦的事情。If there's a beneficiary designation, the retirement, the life insurance, they have to follow that. So say you put your beneficiary is somebody, then you create a trust and that says the beneficiary is someone else. They have to follow what your beneficiary on the website on their paperwork says. So for instance, sometimes people, so in California, you have to write your spouse, who you're married to. And then sometimes people will get divorced and they forget to take their spouse off. And then if they pass away, their spouse's name is still listed there can be a big problem. So it's very important, every so often to look at the beneficiary designations to make sure, or if something has happened to the person that you listed, you want to make sure you take that out, because depending on the company, their process for if this person is gone, who does it go to, may depend if there's nobody else listed. And then also, if the people you want to give the funds to are young kids, like my kids, if you put your young kids' names down by name as the beneficiary on your retirement life insurance, and then something happens to me before the kids are 18, then there still needs to be a small court process to appoint who is managing the funds for them. And then if my kids turn 18, they get to have all of that money right away. They do not have to wait until, says the trust says they have to wait till 25 or something. So it's very important to make sure that your beneficiary designations, your trust, everything is working according to what your family's needs are, so we don't have these issues.
好，谢谢我就是要提醒大家一下，刚刚先生所讲的，就是说，我们有蛮多校友都曾经换过很多的工作或者是家人老公或什么的，就是大家不要忘记你以前的那个工作的地方的 beneficiary designations， 你要去 review 一下。好，在你神志还清楚的时候，都 review 一下，你有没有写给 trust 啦，或者是是你的 beneficiary 还是那些正确的名字什么什么的，就是大家不要忘记你以前工作的那一些leftover 的 assets 很多人都忘记了，也不知道有多少 401k， 也不知道有多少 pension，they don't know。OK， 那些人都应该赶快 wake up。在我们神志还清楚的时候呢，通通 review 一遍 ，make sure you have the right designations。
And that's very important. 对 And then also make sure you keep a list of where those accounts are, because if your trustee does not know, they can take them a long time. They may need to wait for months, see are there any statements coming in the mail, see what they can figure out. Otherwise, then they cannot access the money. So we want to make sure that we have everything working together, but also that our trustee can access it and make it as easy as possible.
我还有一个很快的问题啊，就是讲到这个 real estate deed titling 的问题。如果我有一些 investment properties in different states, let's say Washington State, you name it, California, New Jersey, Texas, 他们在 transfer to the trust 的时候都需要找 local 的 attorney 吗？是不是有一些 state level 的nuances?
So there are differences between the deeds in different states. Typically, if you work for a law firm, like if you work with my firm, for instance, I will make sure to work with someone in those states so that my clients do not have to find someone there. I just take care of it. It is very important that every property is covered, whether what state it is. So usually attorneys will do the work to make sure we can make that happen.
好，那在我们结束之前，那个大华还没有问题，因为我还有最后一个问题。
好，你问吧。
好，对，那就是说现在就给大家举一个，这个好像也是一个真实的例子哈，就是说有 New Jersey 呢有一个妈妈，她就是说年纪大了，那她想回到台湾去住，所以呢，她就把她的房子呢就给了她女儿，然后呢，她就搬回台湾了。最后来女儿就不幸生病去世了。去世了以后呢，那妈妈在台湾她也不想在那边住，她想要回来 New Jersey。可是呢，她一回来发现她这个 New Jersey 的房子呢已经被她女婿卖掉了，所以呢，她变成台湾也没有家，在这边也没有家啊。那像这种 case 是什么原因？就是因为她直接就把房子呢就直接给了女儿，然后她没有想到女儿呢那个时候她 set up 一个 joint ownership。with 他的那个 husband 这样子，所以像这种 case 的话，那个 Shannon 要怎么样处理比较好
？So for one thing, it depends on the state. But for instance, in California, oftentimes I have people say, "Okay, why don't I just put my child's name on the deed now because they're an adult, or maybe want to refinance the house, and I can get a better rate if I put my child's name on too." It's very, very important to speak to someone before you do that, because then you're giving away part of your rights to the house. There can be tax consequences too, to the way that capital gains is being calculated if the house is sold later on. You lose the control. So if you put your child on the title, they sell the house or they pass away, it's based on your child. Their situation, not your own. So that's a very important thing to be aware of for specifically for if we change it to a child during our lifetime, because of the tax consequences, the lack of control. If your wishes change, you cannot get that property back. And then in terms of situations, if something happens to our child, that may be a circumstance that we want to make sure the trust is very specific. When does our child have the full control of the property? Do we want the property to stay in the trust during our child's lifetime? There are different mechanisms that we can do to control, to protect for longer periods of time, for more protection, or to make sure that it fits, what does our families need?
Yeah.OK, Shannon, 那我就趁这个机会问一下，因为我当初写我的 trust 的时候呢 ，lawyer 就问我说，你有没有特别的，这美国人问我有没有媳妇条款，因为我有2个儿子啊，这个媳妇条款、女婿条款，你可不可以解释一下？就是他们的 concern， 就是说有蛮多的人有这个 concern， 就是说，他走了以后呢，钱，比如说2个孩子，就一人分一半，然后呢，儿子就离婚了或怎么样，然后那个媳妇就 automatically get 一半这样子 ，OK？所以有的人会 care about it， 那他就有一些 provision， right？ 有没有什么 comment you want to make suggestions for us?
Yeah. So again, California's community property state, so I'll speak from that perspective. Except that inheritance or gift is your separate property. So if you want to maintain it as separate property, I often suggest that clients tell their kids first, a prenuptial agreement is a very good idea, because that makes it very clear before they got married, that makes it very clear whose asset is what. Even if they get assets later, is that just my own? So if they get divorced, it's clear the judge cannot say, oh, well, do something different. And then again, the inheritance that somebody receives, at least in California, is their separate property. So if I want to keep it as my separate property, I have to be very diligent. I have to keep it in my own account. I cannot use that asset if I do not have a prenuptial agreement. I cannot use that asset to pay for my joint family expenses. I just need to be very careful to keep it separate so that there's no evidence of commingling. So a judge would later say, you actually have this 50-50. And then there are also provisions in trust that we can do to try to keep things in trust longer, or to have different provisions for the time frame, so that if there's the concern about a child-in-law, a daughter-in-law, son-in-law, we don't have as much of an issue. And then the last thing is, regularly what I'll set up for my trust is, if something happens to my child, then, and they have kids, then it would go down to the next generation, 下一代. It wouldn't go to any spouses. So there are some things that we can do to try to protect against those situations. But the best thing that somebody can do really is to make sure their kids get a prenuptial agreement. So there's no question at all. No one can try to fight it later.
好，谢谢。
所以我们现在呢快要接近尾声了哈。那个我们也最后的10分钟呢，请那个 Audrey 帮我们问那个 YouTube 那边过来的问题，好吗？
好，谢谢 Shannon。好，那我们有一些问题在 YouTube 这边，那我先挑比较简短的。所以您刚刚有提到说，所以如果这个学姐她是在 Texas 的话，你也可以 take care of cases, right? Because she asked if you have a license to practice laws in Texas.
So 我没有 bar license in Texas, but there are obviously attorneys that practice in Texas. So you do need to find an attorney who is licensed in the state that you live in, or the state that you are planning to stay in. But 如果你跟我联络，我可以看一看有什么 trusted attorneys 在德州 that I can recommend.
Cool. 所以也有人问说，不知道有没有你的 contact information，你可以留一些什么就是方式给大家，如果有问题的话。
我不知道最好怎么做。Maybe I can change my profile name and then I can say it. So 我的 email 就是 shannon@liusharelaw.com， 就是 SHANNON@LIUS as in Stephen HAIRLAW.com. So 如果你有什么问题，我可以看一看。如果是真的是 legal question, legal advice, I cannot answer unless we have a relationship. 但是 I can make connections, give some helpful tools. So shannon@liusharelaw.com. And 也是如果你们需要这个 PowerPoint slides, I can send that. 最后2个 slides 有一些 different blog posts, 可能是pretty helpful.
Yeah, thank you. 然后还有问题是，有人问说，他可以 carry 他的 Revocable Trust to a different state.
So a Revocable Trust technically is valid throughout the U.S., but there are some differences in the laws in the U.S. 像加州是 community property state, New York 是 separate property state. 在加州我们只是担心这个 federal estate tax, so that 12.06 million per person. But other states may have their own state estate tax. 像 Massachusetts 有一个$1 million state estate tax. So if you're moving to a different state, it's a very good idea to have an attorney look over your trust, see if there's anything you need to be aware of because of the new state, because of the different tax regulations. Does not mean you have to change everything, but there may be some things that need to be changed for the new state.
Okay, thank you. 然后还有一个问题是说，他需要 put 他的 Fidelity account to 他的那个 trust 吗 ？Even they already have the beneficiary.
这是不知道是 Fidelity brokerage account 或是 Fidelity 退休 account, but 如果是 brokerage account 股票的 account, it's still better to convert 改变做 trust account. So putting a beneficiary that says if I pass away, who does it go to? But if the beneficiary is under 18 years old or something happens to that beneficiary, then that designation may fail. So it's good to have a beneficiary, but if we have a trust, it can be even better to make sure there's no issues. And then if it's a retirement account, it's only based on beneficiary designation. Same thing if it's someone under 18 or something else, there may be things we want to consider for, do we want to just put their names as a beneficiary or put the trust as a beneficiary? So it's
okay,
比较 complex question.
Yeah, 它还有一个 following question， 就是说，所以像 bank account 跟 investment account 的话，他们如果没有放到就是 trust 里面，但是有 beneficiary 的话，也是会 go through probate, right?
如果写了 beneficiary and the beneficiary designation works, 不会经过遗嘱认证. So if I put my parents down and I pass away, my parents are still alive, it will go to them without probate, unless there's some other issue. But if I put my own kids down, they're 5 years old, 7 years old, something happens to me, there will still need to be a court process. So a beneficiary designation is not bad, but when we have a trust, it can cover more situations to make sure that there's no probate for any reason.
OK, 了解了。然后还有一个问题，他是说那个Living Trust 是 state specific 吗？如果他搬家的话，需要去。
等一下，我的小孩在门口。
OK, sure.
OK, 对不起。
请问就是还有一个问题，他是说那个如果那个 Living Trust 他搬家的话，这个会受搬家的影响吗？他需要去另一个新的 Living Trust 吗
？Again, they may not need to make a completely new one, but they should, if they're moving to a different state, they should have someone look at it. But if it's just moving within your own state, because these are statewide, the law would be the same. You don't need to have someone look at it just because you're moving. But it's important to make sure when you buy that new house that you let the realtor, let the title company know you have a trust, so the deed is in the trust. And my rule of thumb is 每几个年就是 review your trust, make sure you still understand what it says, make sure you still trust the people who you've listed as your 手签人, make sure you still have the same wishes. It doesn't mean you have to change it so often. In fact, for most people, we're hoping they do not have to change it if their kids are already adults, they trust them. But we just want to make sure that it still works according to your wishes.
所以这有可能是不 work 的吗？万一他到时候跟他的最后的居住地 match 不上的话？
对不起，我不太。
Sorry， 就是他的如果 final address 没有办法 match 他原本的那个 living trust 的那个
Oh, that's okay.
会有
That's okay, 没关系。
OK。
Yeah, 像我有一些 clients, 他们会在加州 move from North California to Southern California. That's not a problem if the address is changed. 最重要只是在你的 Advanced Healthcare Directive. 那个 Healthcare Directive 会说，如果你没有办法决定健康的关系，你的医生要跟谁联络？如果他们搬家，他们的电话号码改变， it's good to let the doctor's office know the new phone number, 那他们就知道怎么可以跟他们联络。但是如果是你自己搬家 if you're staying in the same state, 不需要把什么paperwork 改变。
了解。还有一个问题是说，如果的 beneficiary 是 non-US citizens， 那个 exemption 是还适用的吗
？So my exemption would stay the same. Their exemption would be based on their situation. And you can have a non-US citizen beneficiary, but it does require some more work. So to get the money, say to Taiwan, it does require some work from this end, maybe on the Taiwan end to accept the money. And then they would have Taiwan's tax issues, whatever those might be at the time. Okay. But it would not impact my estate tax exemption.
所以这个 is just like nothing about the US tax? if the beneficial are non-US citizens?
There may be some taxes that they need to transfer that over, but it would not be the estate taxes.
Okay, got it.
Mhm.
So, 他提到了一个 Secure Act， 我不太确定他的问题，但是他的意思说，就是
So
yeah.
Secure Act is something that came out 2020年开始的 and the Secure Act affects retirement in the US. So it did a few things, and there were a few more changes this year too. But for one thing, it changed the age at which you need to start taking out required minimum distributions. So before it's 70 years old. Now it's a few years higher, meaning that you do not have to start withdrawing your retirement funds until a higher age. So that's one thing that some people say is good. But then the big thing for estate planning that was concerning is what they call the death of the stretch IRA. So before 2020, if I write somebody listed down for my beneficiary for retirement, based on their life expectancy, they can take out required minimum distributions on their age for their entire life. If we had an appropriate trust that had the correct provisions, same thing for that person's entire life. Now with the Secure Act, that has been severely changed. So if my retirement goes to my husband, he can take that over his lifetime. But for most other categories of beneficiaries, they only have 10 years to take it out. So if I wanted to go to, say my kids, if my kids are adults when I pass, they only have 10 years to withdraw those funds, as opposed to before 2020, they could have their whole lifetime. So that is a big change. That means that if somebody is expecting to inherit retirement, they should probably talk to an accountant or financial advisor to find out, based on their tax situation, should they take out a little bit every year? Should they take it out all at once at the beginning, all at the end? Because it will have the taxes based on their particular income tax. So that is a big change. It should not change how you save for retirement, how you spend your own retirement. But it is a big difference. And then the last thing is that it does not mean that your family or your beneficiary has to spend all the money in that 10 years, but they have to take it out from that retirement account. So they can still put it, into a brokerage account, into bank account, but there will be that tax penalty when they're taking it out.
OK， 谢谢。还有一个问题，他是写说，他怎么样 move 他的 bank account decide to TOD， 我不知道 TOD 是什么 to my living trust。
So TOD 就是 transfer on death， 就是说是你的 beneficiary. So TOD beneficiary as the trust, it does bypass probate. So if you put the trust as the beneficiary, 不需要担心遗嘱认证。But the difference between TOD beneficiary of the trust and changing the bank account to a trust account is that TOD beneficiary just means if there's money in my account when I pass away, it goes to that person, goes to that trust. Changing the trust account means that the trust is in charge right away. So if I cannot make decisions, it is easier for my trustee to manage the trust account. The bank will give them an easier time to gain access than if it's a TOD account. So that's something that we noticed is it's just easier for the trustee if it's a trust account rather than just the beneficiary as the trust. So both of those do not need the probate, but then just one makes it easier for the trustee during your lifetime.
了解。还有一个问题是，有人问到说的 typical cost for setting up a trust.
It depends. It really, really depends. Depends on the state, depends on the area of the state you live in, depends on your complexity of situation, depends on how much customization, how much service the firm gives, as well as the estate. So if somebody has one house that we need to put in the trust, change the deed versus 10 houses, it can be a big difference. The big thing I would say is if cost seems too good to be true, 你真的需要担心 if someone says it's just going to be $500, it's just going to be $1,000, then it's very possible that all of their paperwork is the same for everyone. They may not take care of a lot of things. They may not teach you the different options. And so that can be very troubling. But if it's quite low, that's just something to be aware of, that they may not be doing all of the different things that we discussed about things to be considering.
了解。所以还有一个是有关于那个 Irrevocable Trust 的问题，就是刚刚那个 Grace 有解释说，如果像一个房产放进去以后，它那个涨幅的 gain 的话，就还是会算之前的那价格。那有那个就是你最早可以什么时候放进去嘛？譬如说你可能现在 OK maybe 30 or 40你就把它放进去，还是有这样子的一个限制吗
？You can put an asset into that GRAT as soon as you get it. You don't want to wait too long, because if the fair market value has grown so much, the value that it is for your estate is based on when you put it into the trust, not necessarily when you got it. So if I got a house 30 years ago, it was $100,000. Now it's $1 million. I put it into the GRAT right now. It's still at that $1 million calculation. So, if somebody knows their estate is worth enough that there is a concern that they want to put it into a GRAT, then they should be thinking about that earlier when they have the opportunity.
OK, yeah. 那所以我们是不是思考很多的那个资产都可以这样子去做考虑？Real estate is a part of them.
Yeah, I mean, usually people will not do real estate if it's their personal residence. Maybe if there are other residences, they may think about irrevocable trust. But more commonly, it's usually stocks, at least in once you're in the Bay Area.
OK, 了解。那今天的题目就到这边了。最后还有一个 Can we have foreign POD or saving
Can you have a
bonds?
foreign TOD? You should be able to, but same thing, it just has to go through a process to get to that person out of country.
OK, 好，谢谢 Shannon， 谢谢你。
谢谢。I hope this is
我还有
helpful.
No, I have one
Okay.
reminder. OK 就是我们这个 generation 呢，常常会 receive inheritance from our parents or grandparents in Taiwan. 所以大家要注意，因为我们很多人都是在美国结婚的。Okay, we never had a chance to go back and register. Okay, in my case, my personal example, 我还是 unmarried in Taiwan's law. Okay, 那如果说我的 husband right inherited a property, 那现在我的孩子通通都没有资格可以 inherit from us. 所以这是一个很重要的问题，我只是提醒大家，就是说还是要去解决啊。如果是 you got married in United States, 你在台湾都没有登记的话。那你的小孩都不是你的法定继承人啊。还有在台湾的 probate， 我们经过一个亲戚的关系啊，这个我才晓得台湾的 probate is as problemsome as here。我们那个亲戚的去世2年了，到现在那个遗产还是没有办法得到认证啊。所以台湾也是 as complicated as we are now。所以大家不要 overlook 啊，你在国外将来的 inheritance， 或者是你已经结到的inheritance， 大家也要想一想啊，就提醒大家。
不好意思，我这边还看到有2个问题请教一下，就是有人问说，那我们家那个 real estate put 得到 trust 的时候，那个中间的需要付那个 tax 吗
？So 如果 at least for California， 如果你放你自己的房子在你自己的生前信托，你的税不会改变。So everything is still connected to your social security number. Your taxes are not changing. If you put it into somebody else's trust, 那有其他的问题。But if it's your own trust, it's still belonging to you. Essentially, that's just a placeholder. So taxes do not get changed.
还有一个他是说问的那个 grade 的话是谁在管理
？Who would 管 the GRAT? So usually you'll have a trustee, whether it's yourself, whether it's third-party trustee, who has to handle all of the calculations and take care of that.
Okay, thank you.
好，那我们今天我们这个一般我们的讲座都是1个小时哈。那今天的话，因为发问的很热烈，所以我们已经 到了8:20了，超过一点时间，不过我想这些时间都非常的值得。好，那我们再次谢谢 Shannon 帮我们分享那么多有用的资讯。我们这个 YouTube 呢会放在这个 ABAF 的网站，而且包括它的 PDF 的 slide 我们也会放上去，所以从那里的话，你们可以找到这个 Shannon 的这个 email address， 好吗？好，那就今天就到这里结束。那大华要不要广告一下我们下次的活动？
对，我们下面呢，大家都说我们一直在跟大家介绍怎么存钱啊，怎么安排身后的事情啊，那怎么不讲一讲我们要怎么玩乐呀？我们自己也 enjoy when we are alive 所以呢，我们希望呢，征询学姐。在外面的，就是说在外州的，比如说已经 retire 到 Florida 去了哈，搬离加州了，或者是搬去德州的，搬去任何地方哈，这个退休生活的地方，那希望我们可以年长的学姐们可以跟我们分享一下他们当初怎么样决定搬去别州，或者是不搬去别州还有哪一州有些什么好处。我相信去 Florida 的人一定讲佛罗里达很好，不然他也不会去，是不是？去 Vegas 的人一定也会讲 Vegas 很好，不然他也不会去。所以呢，我们就想说，有机会的话呢，我们想要邀请一些比较已经走过这段路的学姐们回来跟我们分享他们的心路历程跟他的 decision making points 这样子。所以呢，接下去就很期待啦，我们大家一起来听一些比较轻松的话题这样子。好，今天非常谢谢 Shannon 哈，感谢大家。
谢谢。
谢谢。那我们今天就到这个地方为止哈。那大家关注就是可能是在6月的时候，我们会办那场活动。